For our listeners' benefit, I just wanted to reiterate that very much we're not giving any financial advice or recommendations. We're merely shining a spotlight on how you could invest with impact and with biodiversity in mind by highlighting some of the funds offered by UBAM. Thank you for joining today's podcast. I'm really excited today to be exploring an intersection of two areas that I'm really passionate about today, which is financial well-being and making a difference on the people and planet. And that intersection is what I like to call impact investing. And I'm really thrilled to be joined today by Victoria Leggett, the head of impact at UBP Asset Management, who's going to walk us through an exploration of impact investing, biodiversity restoration, and how you can make, as an investor, a real difference with your capital and where you invest it. So to guide us through it, let me pass over to Victoria. Victoria, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at UBP Asset Management?
Hi, it's really nice to see you today, and thank you for everyone who's listening. I hope you learned something today too. And I am the head of impact at UBP, which means I largely spend my time looking at listed equities, so larger companies, what we would say in the stock markets and across both Europe, the US, developed world, and emerging markets, and figuring out which ones of those are what we would term positive impact businesses and guiding the team in that decision and strategic ones around the impact franchise.
Brilliant. And how did you come to get involved in impact investing? Was that something you've always been involved in your career, or did you pivot towards it? How did that happen?
I've always been interested in how finance can play a role in as a responsible steward of capital, because I think it wouldn't be a shocking statement to say that finance hasn't always done that. I have just personally, I had a Quaker education. I've grown up with the kind of ethos of, with privilege comes responsibility. And I think if you're in a role, in a job where you are the custodian of capital, there is a responsibility that comes with that to make sure that you are generating value, but also in a way that isn't to the detriment of, to your point, people and planet. And I think I feel very strongly that those things can exist together.
No, I really like that. So your driving factor is to be a responsible steward of capital, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess also increasingly to become an advocate for that way of investing, because really, if we are going to solve some of society's biggest problems, then that obviously involves money and it involves capital flowing in that direction. And so I feel like, a driving force at the moment is really to amplify the awareness of how powerful individuals' investments can be, because I think quite often we can feel powerless as individuals.
Absolutely. And actually picking on that point on feeling powerless as an individual, how can individuals have an impact on the world through investing? Let's dive a little bit closer into impact investing. And how do you define that term?
Sure. Well, for us in listed markets, we would define impact investing as investing in businesses that we believe are solving problems. So that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but we're looking at businesses that are trying to help the world transition from what we would say is an old, linear, kind of depletive economy. So that kind of economy where you would take something out of the ground, shape it into something that you would sell to someone who'd use it briefly and then throw it away. It has a sort of a beginning, a middle, and an end. We are trying to find businesses that are much more circular. So are either closing that consumption loop or opening opportunities up to demographics that haven't experienced them before. So that's how we see impact. It definitely comes with a sort of, we would call it a dual mandate. So these solutions have to be profitable. They have to generate returns, and as well as being sort of meeting people's value set. So that's what makes it an investment, not philanthropy, I guess.
That's actually a very important point, because I guess a lot of critique when it comes to trying to do good and invest is that the returns aren't there, or that it's essentially charitable. Now, what do you have to say to that challenge? Can you make a competitive return? And from your experience, how is that borne out?
Well, it depends on your time frame, and like most investments, there is a vast range of options out there. So there are some impact investments, certainly in private markets, which we would call a concessionary kind of investments, where it's not philanthropy, but you would sacrifice some return in return for doing some good. But equally, there are plenty of ways of allocating your capital in an impactful way that should, over the long term, and I would say that's a business cycle, should actually outperform what you would say a reference index or a typical equity investment. And the reason for that, I guess, is again pretty basic, which is it's common sense, right? If you're investing in a company that's solving a problem over the long term, you would expect that company to be in a better position in terms of its ability to drive revenue growth, profitability, than, let's say, a comparative company that was actually causing problems, either climate ones or societal ones. So, you have, if you are a problem causer, you potentially in the longer term have regulation changes that you have to face, which are expensive. You have consumers maybe turning away from your product, which is obviously damaging. And you will struggle to innovate perhaps away from your core business. Whereas if you're a problem solver, that regulation should be a tailwind, not a headwind. And consumers are increasingly switched on to, what is at least neutral for the planet, and in many cases, what's positive. So that would be, again, a sort of business support.
Yeah, it's really about investing for the future, right? Like a lot of us are long-term investors. Investing isn't a short-term thing. Is what I always say. And one of my favorite sort of ways of trying to conceptualize this is, what's the point of investing for 10 to 20, 30 years if by the time you get to using that money, the world is Mad Max Fury Road and it's sand dunes and post-apocalyptic warfare? Like, that is not going to do you any good either.
No. Absolutely. And the more, I would say, the more that individuals engage with their finances and invest with that mentality, then that almost forces the hands of the financial services industry to be longer term too. Because, I would go as far to say that typically finance is probably in its time horizon misaligned with the end customer. Absolutely. Most people save for their retirement or their grandchildren or college education for their kids or whatever. They're not thinking about the next 2 quarters. So why are CEOs of businesses planning for the next 2 quarters or panicking about meeting quarterly expectations? Well, because the financial community will punish their share price if they don't meet those short-term goals. And so, everyone knows that the system, the way it is not serving individuals for the best for the long term, but it needs the whole investment value chain to have a voice about that for it to change.
Absolutely. It's your chance as an individual to really influence change within your sphere, right? It's everything from the behaviors that you have as a consumer in your purchasing decisions all the way through to reflecting that in how you invest. I'm definitely going to drill into how to align your investments with your values. But just before we move on to that, I'm keen to understand, how does impact investing differ from traditional investing?
Well, in a few ways. I mean, there are more commonalities than differences. If by traditional investing, you mean kind of investing in good businesses for the long term, that's what we're doing with impact investing too. If you're talking about what is a typical investment time horizon and investment vehicle now, then the difference is twofold. One is the level of patience as the custodian of that capital, to be patient with that capital, and also to specifically focus on companies that are solving issues, that are beneficiaries from regulatory tailwinds. That's a really big part of what we look at. And we also look at the demand profile. How popular are these solutions? How can we see them growing from a consumer pull perspective as well as a sort of regulation push? So, to have a whole portfolio populated by names like this would be quite different from a typical kind of like a passive fund or an ETF that is emulating a benchmark where you've got a lot of old economy stocks in there.
Yeah, that's really helpful to help our listeners understand the differences between what they're facing in terms of choice.
Yes.
And actually, on that note, a common critique is listed equities are secondary markets. Technically, the capital that you're putting in, it's just buying the stock from another investor. And if you really want to make an impact, you have to do it through unlisted securities, private markets. Now, a lot of our listeners are retail investors who really can't access that. So let's just dive a little bit deeper into how do you actually make an impact in listed equities, and what are the things that contradict that debate that you can't create impact there?
I really love this question. I really love this conversation because I think it comes from a place of concern that impact will be diluted somehow by secondary markets, and that, you know, from that very core, what I would call kind of deep impact space of private project-based finance, that calling anything else impact sort of dilutes the mission. But you make an excellent point. Retail investors cannot access that in the majority of cases. So one way that listed markets can be impactful is the accessibility of them and the scale of them. And, you know, the fact that we have, I think, around £3 trillion invested in people's pensions in the UK, a lot of that in listed equity, you know, a lot in fixed income, whatever the split is. But if everyone engaged with their pension as individuals, moved out of the default scheme, requested to, you know, be in funds that were more aligned with their values, and that's not a recommendation, it's just an example, then, you know, you are moving £3 trillion of capital from potentially destructive business models to regenerative ones. So if that's not impactful, I'm not sure what is. Whereas, you know, in the private market space, individual projects can create huge and really important impact, but they're not doing it at scale, and we need change at scale. So we need all of it.
Exactly. And it comes down to what you can access, really, isn't it? As an everyday investor, a retail investor, I want to grow my capital, but I'd rather it be in businesses that are aligned to my values personally, than it be something that's contradictory to it. Like if you are someone who is, you know, adopting a plant-based diet, reducing your plastic consumption, driving an electric car, and all those things matter to you, why would you want to invest in fossil fuels when the rest of your life, you know, is completely contradictory to that? So, you know, in the listed equity space, there are companies that you can invest in that are more aligned to you. So let's dive a little bit into how impact investing sits next to or in line with values-based investing.
Sure. And actually, just to pick up on one point you made there, there's an excellent website called Make My Money Matter.
The consumer movement.
Yes. And it's specifically focused on people reallocating their pensions. And actually, you referenced a plant-based diet, and we all try and do our bit. You know, reducing meat consumption, making sure that you're turning lights off, insulating homes, etc. Reallocating your pension on average is 21 times more powerful from an emissions perspective than any of those other things. It's not to say don't do those other things, but don't undermine them by then not having a conscious approach to your investments, I would say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, a shout out to Make My Money Matter. It's a consumer-led movement around trying to help everyday people engage with their pensions and drive change. Like you say, like if you go to the website, it allows you to download some collateral to contact the companies who manage your pensions and say, look, I want my money to do better, make my money matter in a way.
Yes.
And like you said, Victoria, you know, there's the option to switch your own funds to switch your own investments and retirement assets from one fund to another. But then if you're not comfortable doing that, put the pressure on the people who run the default options where you're currently investing. Make them start to consider, you know, should we be in fossil fuel? Should we be in more impact-oriented funds? And make them do that.
There's actually a really stark example of when these things aren't aligned, which is a friend of mine who works for a large cancer charity in the research department. And she goes to work. I have such huge admiration for her. She goes to work every day with the aim of trying to minimize people's suffering, discover new cures, really focus on what she sees as the big battle. And she's incredibly committed. She found out recently that her organization's default pension scheme was invested in tobacco stocks. So when we talk about kind of undermining what you're doing, I don't think there could be a more stark example of that. And she will not be the only one.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I can think of so many industries and examples now, everything from like doctors to, like you said, cancer researchers. There's probably a lot of people whose everyday life is spent working on a cause, but then their assets are contradictory to that. So values-based investing, there's a whole range of different ways to go about it. And it's an alphabet soup of things like ESG, which now, it's being used pervasively. There is sustainability. There is ethical-based investing. Could you give me a bit of an idea around how what you're doing with impact investing is different from that?
I really hate the jargon and the alphabet soup of this industry because I think it's one of the main barriers for people getting involved with it, because people understandably are very sort of confused about what am I investing in? Is it what I think it is? And ESG is a case in point. The way that we define it, and part of the problem is there are no actual official definitions of anything. Regulation is changing and tightening up around that. But the way we define it, and I think the way the majority of investors would kind of concur with us, I think, is that ESG really refers to how well a company is run, versus impact refers to what a company sells. And so, for example, you could have a company working in the fossil fuel industry or the tobacco industry that has a very good board structure, both in terms of diversity and independence. This company could have excellent health and safety records. It could have a brilliant environmental policy for its own environmental footprint. It would score, because quite often ESG comes with a score. It might score a AA, a AAA, or a 9 out of 10, or whichever system you use. They're still selling oil or tobacco. So, that's potentially misleading if investors don't know that that's what they're investing in.
And a really good example of where ESG might not align with people's values is, I believe Shell is in the FTSE ESG index. If you're comfortable investing in Shell and being in a FTSE ESG index, then so be it. But I think a lot of people might be surprised by that, especially a company like Shell. And like you mentioned, tobacco companies do often end up with really high ratings in that space. And
actually, it's more than a coincidence. You can see correlations between sort of high controversy industries do tend to score well on ESG because those companies pay a lot of attention and spend a lot of money to make sure that they're doing all the right things operationally to be credible. And there is some evidence that obviously companies that are well run, have good governance, etc. Typically outperform ones that are not well run. So from a financial perspective, there's definitely an argument to be had for investing in companies with good ESG. I'm not criticizing that as an approach, but it's the transparency of what it means that I think needs to be called into question, because I would be very surprised if an individual investor who felt that they were invested in an ESG fund, I'd be very surprised if they knew about or were comfortable, for example, with something like Shell or a tobacco business being in their fund.
Exactly. ESG is so much about risk management, right? It's something for the company to look at. What's my footprint across the environment, society, and how I'm governed, and how do I minimize the risk to my revenues and to my share price? which is a very different way of looking at things than I'm creating a solution that is going to transform our energy grids and lead to better capacity and storage and renewable energy flowing through it. Two very different companies. So like you say, like it's all about what the individual is trying to achieve with their capital and then which one better aligns, which is why personally, I think impact investing, and this is not a recommendation, but like it's one way of achieving that. So let's dive a little bit more into impact investing. And one thing I wanted to ask is, how does it fit into the broader global efforts to address environmental and social issues? What role does impact investing have to play alongside everything else?
A really significant one, particularly if you're thinking about impact investing in listed equity, because the listed equity market is massive. We're talking about trillions globally, and almost every pension fund will have some allocation to equities. Almost every multi-managed fund, every ISA will have some sort of exposure to equities. So it touches almost anyone. And, this capital at scale, if you can move the needle, if these multinational businesses are being rewarded by a superior share price, if they're being rewarded by better valuations, lower cost of capital, these multinationals also have a supply chain which will benefit from that too. And so it becomes a virtuous circle, and that huge amount of capital being steered in a better direction has a massive effect on the type of economy we have.
Absolutely. It's almost a way to kind of steer things at a macro level, would you say?
Yeah, potentially, yeah.
Actually, on the macro side of things, like what sort of role do macro factors play when it comes to impact investing? Everything from like policy, interest rates, regulations, how do they affect impact investments?
In a very similar way to the way that they affect any asset class or any type of investment, in that policy, if it's favorable, is a great tailwind sometimes for businesses. And in the case of impact investing, that has been the case almost everywhere globally over the last few years. You've seen some very interesting regulation coming out, even in places like the US, which tends to be very regulation light. So for example, on something like PFAS, which is often termed the forever chemical that you can find in water systems as a result of its use on a frightening number of things, like clothing, frying pans, etc. It stays in the water system. There's very significant regulation on that in the US, which obviously supports the businesses that have the technology to remove those chemicals. And they're the sort of businesses that we would invest in. So the regulatory and policy backdrop is very important. The stage of the business cycle makes a difference too, particularly when you're talking about equity markets more broadly. And we are investing in impact in listed equities. So to a degree, there's only so much that your investments will diverge from the main equity market if you're entering a point in the interest rate cycle where the market gets concerned about equities, particularly when you're looking at businesses at the early stage. So they tend to be more cash consumptive rather than cash generative. Interest rates going up tends to not be a great backdrop for those sorts of businesses. But then that would apply to funds with very different approaches as well, not just impact. The geography matters too. So we have, through impact investing, exposure to certain sectors that you can only get in certain geographies. And one of those would be microfinance or microcredit. That for us is accessible through several emerging markets, India and Mexico being two. If we felt that the top-down environment in Mexico or India was very challenging and we didn't want to be exposed to those regions, then obviously that would mean that we would miss out on a really interesting impact area from a bottom-up perspective. So that can be challenging at times.
But that makes sense, actually. So it just like any other investment, it's susceptible to different things. So really glad we got to hit that nail on the head, because there is often a lot of people saying, "Oh, regulations impact funds, and they're more susceptible to policy changes." But what I'd like to get listeners to think about is exactly what you said, Victoria, is that when you're thinking about the direction of policy, the direction of travel, there's a lot of challenges that we're facing right now on both societal issues and environmental issues. If you're, as a retail investor, if you think that that's the direction of travel is to remedy those things, then wouldn't the companies that play a role in that benefit? And so impact investment would have a positive tailwind from positive directions of policy that actually supports solving environmental challenges and social challenges.
That's what we're seeing so far, yes.
I would love to understand a little bit more about some concrete examples of the kind of impact that you have seen, or the kind of impact that you have driven through your investments, either a specific stock or a macro level change. We'd love to dive into that.
I have to be quite careful about naming individual stocks.
Sure.
But I'm happy to talk about themes, and as long as it's not perceived as a recommendation, then I can.
Of course, yeah. Nothing here is by any means a financial advice piece or recommendation to buy a specific fund. And I encourage listeners to definitely do your own due diligence and understand if impact investing is right for you. But really, I'd love people to understand the kind of impacts that could be achieved when you do invest in this way through the things that you've seen yourself, Victoria.
Absolutely. Well, we touched on PFAS, and that's part of these forever chemicals, and that's part of a bigger investment sort of sector or industrial vertical on water that we focus on, and there's a lot of interesting impact that can be generated there. So water purification, also water efficiency. Companies that are enabling manufacturing businesses to use far less water, and the water that they use to use it in a more circular way. So we're directing our investors' capital towards businesses like that. In impact, but particularly actually when you touch on the area of nature or biodiversity, the food system is really important. So we look right along the value chain of the food system, and that would include everything from farm equipment manufacturers right through to food producers, branded food, and food retailers. So some ways you can generate impact there is investing behind precision agriculture, for example. And precision agriculture is really interesting to me because it can be seen as a transition technology. So we have what we term conventional farming, which is very depletive, very heavy on pesticides, fungicides, chemical inputs generally, which are, not only potentially damaging for human health, but they are certainly damaging for the biodiversity around farms. They're also expensive for farmers. Yeah. So this is where precision agriculture comes in and can be really powerful because, okay, in an ideal world, perhaps we would shift entirely to regenerative agriculture. Mm-hmm. But people tend to walk along a road, not run down it when they're making decisions that involve a lot of capital. And so for farmers, precision ag is a great way to reduce cost because the inputs required, if you are applying them in a very precise way, reduce dramatically. Mm-hmm. And then obviously, alongside with your input costs reducing because you're not buying as many chemicals, the biodiversity benefits are huge and potentially the human health benefits. And there's no runoff into rivers and into our water systems because of all this excess chemical being washed away. So there's huge impact that can be created around that precision ag space. And then down at the other end of the food system, we invest in a number of food retailers who are very committed to their supply chain. So they support short supply chains, local sourcing, regenerative practices. In some case, they even fund that transition or part fund that transition and are very, in one case, very price competitive also with their produce because, when you're coming to a consumer, particularly at the moment when we're all conscious about inflation, particularly around food, then it's much more challenging when you say, well, you can have something that's better for the environment, but it's going to cost you a lot more. So that's that's a piece that we're cognizant of too. And we can definitely access companies who are providing improvements at no further or little further cost to the consumer.
That's really cool. Like just in those examples that you highlighted there. So there's companies involved in water purification and that, results in cleaner water for everyone. There are companies that are involved in precision agriculture, which means less energy intensive farming that helps soils regenerate and again makes it easier for the farmer to produce better quality food that then also benefits us.
Yes.
The third theme is biodiversity creeping in terms of all these positive impacts on the wider planet and biodiversity. That's just a few impacts there from investing in this way. And I want to come into biodiversity a little bit because I'm really interested in what you're doing there. What do you do in the realm of biodiversity? Because I understand you've got a biodiversity restoration fund. So how does that differ from impact investing and what is biodiversity restoration?
It's an extension of what we do with our broader impact funds rather than a change in direction. So the broad impact funds, we look at both societal solutions and environmental ones, and that would include climate and nature. With biodiversity, we're very specifically looking at areas that can create a benefit to the natural world. And sometimes that overlaps with climate solutions, but not always. There are sometimes some conflicts there. And then also, because it's entirely focused on that area, we're not looking at areas such as education and microfinance, which you would look at, or healthcare, which you would look at in a broader fund. So that's the distinction, but it still very much follows the same idea that we talked about a few moments ago, which is companies that are fixers. And in the case of the Biodiversity Fund, also companies which have a very open and progressive approach to their supply chain, particularly if that supply chain is very complex, because it's often in the supply chain or the top of the supply chain that are that's where the biodiversity hotspots are. And that's where the change needs to really be made. So if you think of a company that sells chocolate bars, it's not really at the point of manufacturing the chocolate bar that's the issue. It's where the cocoa is sourced and how it's sourced and what are the issues around that in terms of deforestation or monocultures, etc. So that's a really big aspect of it. And biodiversity is, almost a sort of too complex or a sort of scientific term really for nature. It's all about the abundance and variety of species. And the more wild species in particular, and the bigger variety, then the better we are as humans. And so we're talking about not just the animals that you think of, those sort of big fauna like polar bears and lions, but everything down to microbes, to various types of fungi, to different types of plant. That variety is absolutely critical to supporting a ton of kind of what we would say are ecosystem services that support our economy. So, whether it's weather patterns, watersheds, all of these things come for free. Nature provides them for free. Pollination. And if our biodiversity is depleted to a degree where there's a tipping point, then those ecosystem services cease to work. And that has a direct impact on our financial economy. So
I loved what you said there, that like these ecosystem services are for free. Like it's something that we take for granted, right? Like water tables, forests, they filter water for us. You don't have to build a 200 million pound water filtration plant that you probably have to replace and repair every 10, 20 years. If you just enrich the soil and the forest systems, that will just make it, continuously and improving its ability to filter water for us. So that's an example of one environmental service. I would love to understand from your experience, like what other systems are there that we're kind of, losing sight of as providing such a value to us from biodiversity?
Well, there are a couple. One's local and one around pollination. There's a good example in China. So the local one, there's been a lot of talk recently about the housing crisis in the UK and this perceived conflict between building new homes and destroying the environment. And, the pressure that the euphemism is nutrients, the pressure that extra nutrients from humans would place on the natural world. Well, there are a lot of bio-based solutions that can be supportive of that. And a lot of that involves really kind of investing in wetlands, near housing projects, coordinating the building of new communities with supportive, robust nature-based solutions close by. So, really good wetlands, and peat is also a good example of that too. Gardens coming back rather than paved areas, massive support for flood prevention, massive support for rivers not getting clogged up with sewage. And we know from the press over the last 6 months, particularly in the UK, that's an area of real concern. And so, I think just being more creative about the role that nature can play and those ecosystem services can play in something that could actually solve a problem in quite a clean way, quite a neat way. And then when it comes to pollination, and I think conservatively, I think 75% of our food, or 3 bites in 4 that we take, sometimes it's quoted, is pollinated by animals. So obviously, if you have a reduction in pollinators, typically we talk about bees, they're kind of the headline species, but they're not the only ones. That presents a challenge for our food system and our food security. And that might feel quite abstract, but there's a real life example of that in China, which has been quoted a few times. I don't know if your listeners will have already heard this story, but I find it so frightening that it's worth retelling, even if they have. So there's a particular province in China that focuses really on the production of tree fruit, so orchards, Sichuan province. And the use of pesticides and chemicals in this growing region has been so pervasive over the years that the natural bee population has died out. And now it may have got better in the last couple of years, but at that point, obviously the trees are not being pollinated. So in each growing season, hundreds, if not thousands, of people are employed to climb up ladders with paintbrushes and transfer pollen from one flower to another. Now, the cost involved in that at that scale is mind-boggling. Also, the inefficiency of it versus the bees. They don't achieve the same rate of pollination. And that was something that nature did for us for free without asking much in return, except to not basically be poisoned.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, that's a real economy hit. And actually the chair of our biodiversity committee, Tony Juniper, and I urge anyone who's interested in this subject to look him up on YouTube or one of his books, because he's a fascinating guy. He made a strong point of emphasizing at the beginning of his journey with us that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature, not the other way around. And it would serve as well to remember that. So the decisions we're making about setting up a biodiversity restoration fund, it's not actually from a place of, I love nature and I think we should be doing nice things with nature. It's from a place of, this makes economic sense. This makes financial sense. Ignoring this subject is a disastrous thing to do.
No, absolutely. And oh my God, so many points there, like people playing the role of bees. I can't imagine that that's a particularly joyful job to do either. So there's the element of, A, it's really expensive, and B, it's probably not fulfilling work. And the diversity of that as well. Like you said, humans aren't quite as efficient pollinators as a bee that can fly wide radiuses. And you've got species diversification issues with that as well. So many things there, just to come from, let's just save some bees and pollinators, right? And then the quote you said from Tony Juniper, which I think is fascinating. The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature. I think that's something that a lot of people have forgotten, if not ever realized. So much of natural outputs, in terms of the food we eat, to like the water systems, the land that we build on, without nature, all of that kind of crumbles, and we have to foot the bill for that as well.
Yes. It becomes very expensive at some stage. Sort of living beyond our planetary boundaries becomes, aside from unpleasant and dangerous, it becomes very expensive. So it's really about, again, coming back to long term, but actually now we're at a point where this is near term, medium term thinking too. It makes sense to allocate capital to businesses that are trying to reverse the engines on this, who are trying to solve problems, who are effectively disruptors of the old economy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's trying to bring things back to perhaps how we should have always done it, or how we had done it at least about 100, 200 years ago. Mm. And that comes back to, I say this term a lot, and listeners will hear it a lot in this podcast, but values-based investing. If that's the kind of change that you're trying to affect yourself, like, whether you have a little permaculture garden or the likes, again, the impact that you could do by moving your investments to these big companies that are solving these problems at a macro, economy-wide level, like is such an alignment of interests if you're so inclined to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we don't, in the fund, we don't invest in Nestle, so this isn't a stock recommendation. But just if you take a moment and think that the market cap, the size of Nestle, is bigger than the GDP of quite a few countries. This multinational, which has a huge power in terms of its buying of raw ingredients, if this multinational pays attention to biodiversity, to encourages regenerative practice, that's huge. That comes back to the scale of listed equity markets. That can make a really meaningful difference. Absolutely.
Actually, that makes a lot of sense, from everything from the amount of agriculture that they have sway over, to even, the entire supply chain, the packaging and labor. Yeah. I didn't realize it was so big. I mean, I knew Nestle was big, but it's not even one of the top 10 companies of the world. But yeah, you're right. It's got GDP, it's got a market cap that's larger than GDP footprints.
Yeah.
So when it comes to biodiversity, we're talking about big planetary-wide systems here. Is this really something that investors should be bothered with, or isn't this the role of governments?
I think you could ask that question about almost anything that's meaningful or important. I certainly don't feel investors should be guilted into it. And I think there's been a lot of guilt laid at the feet of consumers in the last few years. So much so that, people, I say people, I include myself in this. I feel horribly guilty if I, put a cup or a bottle in the wrong bin. And actually the impact that can have is arguably nowhere near the impact of our choices with our investments. But still, the corporate world and the policymakers are, and the financial institutions are the people who are holding the levers here. So consumers shouldn't feel guilty, but that doesn't mean that they should be asleep at the wheel when it comes to their own money. It's their money. It's not mine. It doesn't belong to anyone but them. They've earned it. So rather than why should they bother, I would kind of flip that and say, why would they let anyone else make those decisions about something so fundamental? And particularly when you get the sort of collective power of engaged capital. It doesn't matter if you've got £10. There are thousands of people with £10, and that adds up. And all of those people being awake with their finances can make a massive difference on the way companies do their business and the way financial organizations structure their products and the way policymakers regulate. So that's why.
No, absolutely. It's like a wall of money coming towards, governments and companies and pushing pressure. Like, if you think about it as an individual, the things that you can do, yes, you can bring a metal straw around to replace plastic straws, and I'm not telling you to stop that if you do that. But you can recycle and all of that. But then if every person put their £10 investment or their £100 investment towards biodiversity and the like, it's creating this giant force that just multiplies itself. It's like, writing to an MP versus everyone writing to their MP in a similar way. Like, money does talk and money does drive change. And I like what you said about consumers, not having to feel guilty about environmental issues, that in the way that a lot of burden has been passed on to us. I think the majority of plastic that's currently floating around in the ocean is actually from industrial plastic waste, fishing trawlers, nets, etc. Our plastic straws are definitely in there somewhere, but they're not the majority of the waste, and consumers do have to bear that quite often, and this is a way to perhaps exercise your way to drive change.
Absolutely, yeah.
I would love to understand from your experience as an investor as well, what sort of changes have you seen? What kind of positive outcomes from biodiversity restoration that you've achieved in your funds?
Well, we're still at a very early stage. So the Biodiversity Fund is 2 years old. And as a theme, as an investment theme and something to interact with corporates about, is still very new. So success for us at this stage is about engaging with the companies that we invest in and for them to be responsive and committed to making changes. And we're already talking about, for a company to be in our fund, we've judged them to be on the right track in terms of biodiversity. It's more about kind of accelerating that shift and particularly around areas around disclosure on what they're doing, because that helps us measure the impact more accurately. And at the moment, that's difficult for us to do. But a kind of concrete example of that engagement working, I guess, is as part of our biodiversity committee work, we decided one area, and this kind of loops through the conversation we've had, I think, one area that we feel is really missing is a collaboration between different stakeholders. And I think that term stakeholder can be overused, but to create systems change and not just a one-off case study, to create real systems change, you need the finance sector, corporates, policymakers and NGOs, particularly in the conservation space, all to talk to each other and to come around the table with an open mind. Because as much as finance quite often it operates in a silo and sees things from their own perspective, I have learned that so too does conservation quite often. There's a funding model there. People, whether it's dedicated conservationists and academics are used to applying for funding or get it from donors and do their work, and that's it. And the idea of collaborating with a corporate or a financial institution can be quite challenging for them. But we've had an absolute collapse in nature. I think the species collapse, I don't want to misquote, but it's well over 50%.
I think it's 70. I think
I was thinking it's 65, 70%.
Yes. Of species have been lost
since the 60s.
And of our own doing.
So basically, it's not a judgment. It's just an observation that the current model isn't working. We very early on decided that for us, impact would be to get these different people talking to each other. So we, in our first, we refer to them as workshops. We did a workshop on the food system, and we got corporates that we invest in all to come along, agricultural manufacturer, a food producer, a couple of food retailers, food service business. And then we brought along also the NGOs that we have chosen to work with. We have effectively a fee sharing agreement with them. So they benefit from the success of this fund. But in order to receive that benefit, we want them with an open mind to guide corporates and help them navigate these challenges. And this meeting was really fascinating. And a few things emerged from it that we are continuing to explore with all those different stakeholders. The limiting factors for change for a company. time and again, it was the same three things. We're confused about regulation. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to measure success. How do we know if we're creating biodiversity net gain? And thirdly, consumers don't seem to care. They get climate, but they're not, that nature isn't resonating with them, and we haven't found a way to make it resonate. And I thought that last one in particular was fascinating and a big surprise for me. So that's an example of kind of the investor impact or the investor additionality that we're having with these funds by bringing these people together and starting to map out how companies can overcome some of these big challenges that we've collectively identified.
No, I love that because like as an individual, it's not something I can do. So, by pooling my capital with others, with managers like yourself who can take this action and can drive that change. I'm shocked that biodiversity hasn't quite entered the sort of public perception as these companies are citing. But yeah, maybe it's because there's been such a focus on climate that we've kind of neglected some of the things that are also in the environment. I think recently I read, was it the IMF did a monetary assessment of the value that we get from certain biodiversity. I think it was a 2019 study. And the value of whales to the world is $1 trillion, with a single whale being about 2 million. And that's because of the benefits they provide to marine ecosystems, phytoplankton populations, all the way through to carbon sequestration. And $1 trillion, like there's only about 8 companies in the world that have a market cap that's as large. But, to think that the world's whale population has that value, it's sad that we've gotten to the stage where we have to assign monetary value to things. But, what are your thoughts on how is quantifying things like this, making it easier to protect them and easier to capture the opportunity? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's inevitable. And certainly in finance, it was going to be no surprise that people like to put a number on something and people like to be able to calculate it. And, that's been a big thrust behind the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was a set of targets that was released towards the end of last year. It's kind of the nature equivalent to the Paris Agreement. We always talk about Paris when we talk about climate and the 1.5 degrees. The Global Biodiversity Framework is the nature version of that. So it was a big deal. It happened at COP15, which is the convention on biodiversity. It's the equivalent of, well, we're going to have COP28 shortly, which is on climate. So they're not in sync, but they similar structure every couple of years. And so this was a big one. And one of the targets in there in this framework is all about making it mandatory for or encouraging financial institutions and corporates to report on biodiversity. So, being able to measure something arguably does make it easier to manage. The only caveat I would stress is I'm fine with that. And I think that is necessary and important. But I wouldn't want people to then feel that things that you can't measure don't matter. So kind of the flip side of it. And, you only need to think of a very personal example. Like, if you have a partner, a dog, a cat, a child, a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, and on the assumption that you love them, at least some of the time, and someone asked you, well, how much do you love them? Put a price on it, put a number on it, quantify it. That's impossible, but it doesn't mean that it's not hugely important.
No, I really agree with that because, yeah, you're right. Like there's, people are assigning values to certain natural systems now in an effort to try and engage people. But there's also so many things that we can't assign values on. And even, that $1 trillion estimate on the whale population comes with a lot of caveats going, it's a conservative assumption because we still can't trace all the interconnected parts that a whale has to the wider world. So there's lots of other benefits as well. Just like, the whole bee example, the pollinator example you mentioned in China, like that's a direct impact to one company of their of there being a loss in pollinators, but what about the wider society that lives there and the wildlife that lives there? There are so many impacts that we just cannot measure, and I agree with you. We don't want that to be a barrier to actually trying to manage them. But on the topic of measurement, as an investor, if I were to allocate capital to impact investing and biodiversity restoration, how would I know what's come out of it? I mean, yes, I can see my financial returns. Financial returns are probably the easiest way that I can track how my money is growing. But how do I know that like I set it for this purpose and it's delivered on that purpose? How is that impact or biodiversity net gain measured and reported back?
This is more complex with listed equity, with secondary markets. So if you have an impact investment in private markets, so for example, if you part fund the construction of a hospital and the hospital's there at the end, then you know what you've achieved from an impact perspective. If you're investing in listed businesses that already exist, then it's of course more challenging. So, and we recognize that. And it comes down to a lot of the time a corporate disclosure on some areas, and what we've been able to derive from conversations with companies, so our bilateral engagement with companies. So we do a combination of things. Firstly, we report on what we can and what's available, and that will be a combination of we'll demonstrate the ESG, so the operational, the footprinting information on your investment in the fund. We'll also show some bottom-up key impact indicators or key performance indicators, however you choose to phrase it. So you can associate a certain amount invested with a certain activity. So whether it's a number of bottles that have been recycled, whether it's amount of the tonnage of carbon that's been extracted from the atmosphere, the amount of grid that's being converted to smart grid or something associated with a given amount. So we do that. And we also produce case studies of engagements and the milestones achieved and then the end result of that. So we're very transparent about that. At the same time, in parallel, recognizing that's not perfect. And what we can't do right now is say this, 2.4 is your biodiversity net gain. Unfortunately, we can't do that. But because we can't, we are very transparent about what we can and can't do. And in parallel with all the stuff we can report on, we agitate for better disclosure, more information. We directly encourage companies in a very targeted way to disclose on particular things so that we can improve that reporting.
That's helpful because in the end of the day, you want to be able to see that I put money towards this, it's grown in this way, and it's done these things. And I think transparency is critical in that area. So I love the work that you're doing there. I'd love to understand, what do you offer investors in the space of impact investing in biodiversity restoration? What funds, what offerings do you have, and where could they get access to it?
So we have a number of what we would call broad impact funds in the listed space. We have a global, a European, and an emerging market equity fund. So there are three options there, and those three funds invest in both social impact and environmental impact. So they're, we're very careful that they don't accidentally become renewable energy funds or accidentally become healthcare funds. There's a real balance of what we would call SDG or Sustainable Development Goals that your listeners may have heard of, that we're really trying to access as many of those goals as possible. Restoration, I will be very clear, is a long-term aim. It's not what we're achieving right now. And again, that's a global fund. We're invested right across the developed markets, and with big exposure to North America, US, Canada, and a bit of exposure to Japan, across Europe, and a couple of emerging market names in there too. All of these funds are available on various different platforms, retail platforms in the UK. But there's one particular area that I'm not necessarily recommending that people invest behind our funds, but in general, if you want to know more about sustainability and you want to go to a place where you feel that you can trust that some of the work has been done on a sort of sustainability audit of these businesses, then I would guide people to look at the Big Exchange platform. We are a founding member of that, and it's a great place to look as an individual investor for different funds in both listed equity and fixed income that have already been heavily vetted for their sustainability credentials. So you should feel more comfortable that there isn't the greenwashing going on that we hear about a lot these days.
No, that's very helpful, actually. And I personally use the Big Exchange myself. Again, not a recommendation. It's what I found worked for me. And again, have a look and see if you're interested in these funds, where you can find them and what's the best way for you to access them. So it seems that there's a lot of companies out there that have jumped onto this idea of impact, sustainability, and the like, and it's almost becoming a bit of a marketing term. And so there's this term that some of our listeners may be familiar with, greenwashing or impact washing, which is where someone purports to be having an impact on the world or the environment in a outsized or even non-existent way to what they actually are. What do you have to say about things that investors have to watch out for when it comes to greenwashing and impact washing?
I think it is important to ask for as much information as possible on the non-financial aspects of the funds, whatever they are. So that you, again, it goes back to the conversation we had earlier about ESG versus impact. Both are very credible ways of investing, but it's important as the end investor that you know which one suits you. And so it's all about transparency, I would say. The greenwashing debate extends further along the value chain than just the end investor picking a fund. So, for us, when we're looking at corporates, there is sometimes a degree of corporate greenwashing too. And particularly since the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals became very popular, these little coloured squares that we see almost everywhere now, there are lots of corporates that we will do our initial research on that claim to have an impact on, 16 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And we quite often, our opinion differs. So again, much like our listeners, much like the end investor, we as asset managers also have to do that digging and find if the transparency isn't there, then ask those questions. And then circling back to something like the Big Exchange, that should provide at least a degree of comfort that a professional third party has audited those funds and ranked them on their sustainability credentials.
And that's really helpful because it's just trying to, see the wood from the trees. And what about some of the common misconceptions that investors might come across when it comes to impact investing in biodiversity? Are there any myths you want to dispel?
I'm not sure that the industry, particularly in biodiversity, is old enough to have established myths yet. So I think we touched on one of the major areas of debate, which is whether listed equities can be considered impactful. And I hope we've addressed that today. When it comes specifically to biodiversity, I think, again, like a lot of questions on measurement in this industry, it focuses a lot on, well, there isn't an agreed way to measure this. There isn't the disclosure, and therefore it can't happen. I really rail against the perfect being the enemy of the good. And we don't have all the answers, but I'm not pretending to. What I am trying to do is to fire up the engines and get it moving. And as we do that, this is an iterative process. This is an iterative industry. Yeah. We just simply cannot afford environmentally or financially to just sit and wait for perfect information before we start.
No, absolutely. I mean, like you said, it's no longer even a long-term impact that we're trying to achieve. There's some serious deadlines for the people and the planet in many ways. So absolutely get involved in allocating capital to fixes, which is exactly what you do.
Yes. And actually possibly one other thing that I would add is that biodiversity, for very obvious reasons, is seen as an environmental problem or solely an environmental problem. And one aspect that is very rarely touched on is how biodiversity or nature is a social problem too, not just access to blue and green space for people, which there is a wealth of evidence to support that is very additive for people's mental and physical health. But also, there's an increasing body of evidence to show that food, and coming back to the food system, it always does with biodiversity, food grown in healthy soil has a significantly higher trace mineral vitamin content than food grown in what we call conventional farming now, which is effectively an inert substrate with lots of chemicals. It can also taste better. Not always, and the evidence isn't there in a sufficient way because not enough people are measuring it to say that every time you eat something that's been grown regeneratively, it's better for you and it tastes better. But more often than not, it is becoming kind of accepted. And so when you start to see this as actually a consumer experience issue as well as an environmental one, given how much, how large the vitamin and supplements industry is, in monetary terms, if you were eating food that was more nutritious and you didn't need supplements, we're not talking about people spending more in total to make healthier choices. And that's just that's a new angle, a fresh angle on this, because I think the climate and the environmental ones are well understood. But coming back to that corporate point of customers don't necessarily care, they might if they realize that there was the meaningful difference.
Exactly. You think about the things that people are battling with when it comes to suddenly increasing allergies and the like, who knows how much of that can be fixed with just more nutritious food.
Yes.
And I'm hoping we'll find out.
Yes.
In the future.
There's a whole different podcast that we could do all about this topic, which is absolutely my passion. But I won't bore your listeners with it right now.
I think I might take you up on that for a follow-up. One thing I wanted to help our listeners understand is, and you mentioned this earlier, like with the Biodiversity Restoration Fund being only 2 years old and like you're starting to see things move in the right direction. It's a long-term investment fund, like as should all investments and as should impact investing. But just to help our users understand, what are the different patterns of returns they can expect when investing in impact investment funds or in biodiversity restoration funds when compared to investing more conventionally in index funds or the broader market or something?
For an investor thinking about these funds, think about them with the same sort of risk profile as you would with any other equity fund. Over the cycle, we anticipate, due to the types of businesses we invest in, we anticipate outperforming that equity index. But clearly, if your entry point and your exit points were wrong, then that wouldn't be the case. So I think you have to think of the return profile as similar to an equity benchmark. And as we have global funds, emerging market funds, European ones, then, that benchmark performance differs quite dramatically some years, and some years it seems to be very correlated. So
exactly. And like there are certain sectors and companies that you just won't allocate to that at times might do better. And how do you help investors understand that? So for example, energy is currently in high supply and demand. Oil companies have had a bit of a windfall and done really well. How do you help investors understand that by avoiding that, it's not to their detriment, or how do we rationalize that?
There simply are going to be points and situations where these funds will underperform, and that the broader benchmark, and that is exactly the kind of scenario you're talking about when energy is leading the market up, or when defense businesses are leading the market up. So at points of conflict. And that, you could say that for equities generally, when we hit points of conflict, typically gold becomes very popular, equities become less popular. But within the equity space and within that sort of breakdown of sectors which we can and can't invest in or would wish to or not wish to. But equally, there are, again, it comes back to over the long term, when you're talking about sectors that are structurally challenged, they will enjoy their time in the sun periodically, but it is not it's not a structurally positive investment, I would say. And so I think you can either be incredibly short term and clever and try and switch between different styles of funds, or you can be long term and go with your view on what the economy will look like in 10 or 20 years. We publish which sectors we invest in, which we don't, that all that information is available. And we make it very clear, I hope, to our unit holders, the areas that are excluded from our list. So there are definitely going to be points in the market where we are not going to be leading the pack.
No, I absolutely understand that. And I think that's fair for our listeners to appreciate as well. Like, when you aren't investing in certain things, there will be times where there is outcomes that you won't be able to participate in when those things rally. I've been in the space myself as a personal investor, and yeah, it's tumultuous. But then I only put capital away in those types of areas where I am having a 10 to 20 year time horizon. So it does take a readjustment, and to avoid the sort of regret aversion of, if I'd only just been in the S&P 500. I don't even know how much of the S&P 500 will be around in the next 10 to 20 years, given some of the business models there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I know it's a complex one for people to get their heads around, but also I think it's important to kind of underline that where we can, we are very conscious of these. It's a style bias, right? It's a factor bias. We're very conscious of it, and we do what we can to mitigate. So in an environment where, the market is willing to take more risk, that is a market that also typically, not all the time, supports higher growth companies, smaller companies. We would tilt our fund to be more exposed to those sort of areas. In the opposite sort of market, we would definitely go up the market cap scale, up the size scale. We would have much less exposure to companies that were heavily indebted, for example. And so there's a lot that we can do within our universe, within our investable universe, to mitigate those factors. No, we can't buy oil, but oil can be correlated with other things that we can buy. And, again, it's not about being invested in the sort of necessarily the pure play poster child of impact investing. There are also a lot of tangential ideas which sound less exciting. You referenced smart grids earlier. That's a utilities business. It's still a really important part of the energy transition, but it has a very different risk profile from a wind turbine manufacturer.
No, absolutely. This has been such a great discussion. Like, we've taken our listeners and you've taken me on this journey of understanding impact investing and really what difference can you make when you have capital that you want to invest, all the way through how do you understand those impacts have been delivered, how do you make an informed decision, and we dived into biodiversity as sort of long-standing investing in life itself, and really is what biodiversity is to how do you actually do that with your capital. So thank you so much for guiding us through that exploration today, and I love the technical details we covered towards the end on what to expect as an investor and how to be discerning on that. I'd love to end with a bit more of a personal note. Like, you started at the start of this conversation, you said that you were driven to be a responsible steward of capital, and that's how you got involved in this. Through your career so far, do you have a story that you could share about how you've seen something positive being achieved through the allocation of capital in this way, that either you've driven yourself or you've seen a big societal impact or environmental impact? Would love to get a bit of a personal anecdote.
There are lots of examples of companies, particularly in emerging markets, who we've talked to. And at the beginning of that conversation, they had no climate commitments, no sustainability report, no way to really articulate what they were doing, even if what they were doing was really great. And I'm thinking of actually a microfinance company that specializes in small loans to women in rural areas. It's doing fantastic work, but it wasn't telling anyone about it. And after a lot of conversations with that business, they now reporting, I would say their reporting is best in class now. better than most European businesses that are much bigger than them. And as a result of that, they are being recognized by different institutions who are looking for sustainable investments. And so, we're helping put companies on the map by doing that sort of foundation work with them. So that always makes me very excited, because sort of exposing a company to a bigger investor base is really great. It's great for them. It's great for us too. But I guess the other thing that, particularly when markets can be tough sometimes, or policy goes in reverse, or there's a political issue that makes me think the world is going in the wrong direction, the thing that gives me kind of solace and renews my determination to continue is reminding myself that this isn't my money. I'm hugely privileged to be looking after other people's money that they've gone to work for every day and earned and being taxed on. And after that, they've decided to invest it in one of my funds, and because they believe in what we're doing. And the very fact that that person has done that is impact itself, So that is, it's just a hugely privileged place to be, and it's very motivational.
No, I love that. And that's a really good place to end on. And it reminds me of something a colleague of mine once told me, Julia Drebler. She's a bit of a pioneer in the field of sustainability and stewardship. And she said that financial services is quite rightly a services business. So we are here as stewards of capital to help people grow their money and reflect their values, and ultimately, for the betterment of all.
Yes.
Brilliant. Yeah, so thank you so much for your time today, Victoria. It's been a really, really pleasurable discussion, and I look forward to what our listeners have to say.
Absolutely. Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. So today we've talked about a couple of funds that are available in the UK market. And if you're interested in any of them in other markets, do have a look and see where you can find them. And very much these are not financial recommendations or advice, but very much just a guide to what's out there in the impact investing and biodiversity restoration space. Before making any investments, it's very important that you consider your own personal situation and how these different investment funds could fit into your financial plans.